Good morning for those of us who are joining from New Mexico, and good afternoon to those of us joining from the East Coast. I'm really glad to have you all here today. So what we're actually going to do is in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind typing where you are joining us from this morning and afternoon, that would be great. And for those of you who have not met me before, my name is Takara Lake, and I'm the Director of Education at the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. Before introducing today's speakers, I have a couple housekeeping notes before we begin. First, I hope you've been able to participate in some of our Journalism Under Fire sessions that we posted this past week. If not, never fear, we have an entire week's programming coming up. But I am happy to say that this is our first Journalism Under Fire student session of the conference. So thank you for joining us. I would like to draw your attention to one event that we have coming up on Monday. So this Monday from 6 to 7 p.m. Mountain Time. We will be having a Q&A with Maria Ressa and Ramona Diaz. Maria Ressa was one of Time's 2018 Persons of the Year. She is a journalist from the Philippines, and we will be giving students, teachers, all conference pass holders, and ticket holders for that event access to her documentary, 1,000 Cuts. You will be given access to that this weekend. And on Monday, we will have the Q&A session with both Maria Ressa and Ramona Diaz. So please join us for that. The second thing I want to mention is that this morning I will be showing a PowerPoint with photos. Please let me know in the chat box if you are unable to see the photos or if it's too small, and I will try and help you with that. And lastly, the student sessions are geared towards high school and college students, but adults are more than welcome to attend. The only thing I would mention is that when we take Q&A, I will be giving student questions preference. But without further ado, I am honored this morning to introduce Zitlali, who is a senior at Mandela International Magnet School and one of our outstanding CIR High School Fellows, who will be introducing both of our speakers this morning.
Thank you. Today, I have the privilege of introducing our two speakers. Tina Susman is a senior editor at Time Magazine, and she has nearly 25 years of experience as an editor and reporter. For the Associated Press and Newsday, Tina oversaw and contributed coverage from throughout Africa. For the Los Angeles Times, among multiple roles, Tina was the Baghdad bureau chief. Her work has been recognized for awards from the Society of Professional Journalists and the Overseas Press Club. Katina Paron is a journalism educator and editor. She has helped thousands of teens earn bylines in professional publications. From the award-winning Since Parkland to supporting students' publication, her work elevates the voices and experiences of young people and provides journalism training and mentorship to teens. She is the author of A Newshound's Guide to Student Journalism and a journalism professor at the City University of New York and editor of The Future is Miss, a teen-written column for Miss Magazine. Welcome. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Zitlali. Thanks for that. So we're going to really kind of get into the basics of what it means for you to be a journalist now, why it matters, and give you an exciting insight into the world of being a foreign correspondent. But first, we want to hear from you. If you could answer, I believe in the chat, we want to hear what you think a journalist does. Right? We can say journalism, we can talk about being a reporter and editor, but from your standpoint, either as a college or high school student, we want to hear what it means to be a journalist to you. So you can go ahead and type those answers in, and I'll keep talking and we'll see them pop up from there. One of the things, we could talk about the kind of the basics of how they investigate a report, but also want to kind of talk about the larger aspect of the role of journalism in society, that journalism is about not necessarily being the experts, right? I always think of journalists as the smartest people I ever meet. And they are, but they're not necessarily experts in all these different topics. What journalists are good at are becoming or finding the experts and asking good questions. But the larger issue really is, why do they do this? What's the role of journalism overall? And this goes to this idea of journalism being the practice of verification. I'll say that again. Journalism is a practice of verification. And what that means is, when you think about fact checking, right? Around the election, there was a lot of talk about fact checking. And that's kind of the role of journalism. It wasn't a partisan attack on anyone. It's really the role of journalists to be fact checkers, and the role of them to make sure what they publish is accurate. So what journalists spend a lot of time doing is finding the people who provide the experiences, providing the sources, providing the research and the proof of what they're writing is accurate. I tell my journalism students all the time, which makes them very nervous, but I tell them, everything they write has to be true. Like literally every single word they write has to be accurate. And Tina will talk a little bit about the role of being an editor in that. But for the reporters, they're the ones going into the field. They're the ones talking to sources and finding out the information. And if one person says A and somebody else says B, then it's up to them to really curate that. They're not stenographers. They don't go to events and just write down what happens in the order of the events. But they're going to events and they're going to do this reporting as a way to really find out what the truth is. And there's been some great answers. I'm seeing them pop up here and there in the chat about a journalist's role is to find the truth, and they investigate and they report. And these are all 100% accurate. The question from there then is to ask why. Like, what is the role of journalism in that way? And that goes to the aspect of journalists' jobs are to inform people so they can make better decisions about their lives. There's a slide. Can you put up the Twitter? I think we can skip the comic, but just go to the tweet. So there's a slide. This came up right around the election, where we all spent so much time paying attention to what news is. Great. So this was something that I just showed up on my feed about that journalism should provide three things. Information that helps people understand and navigate, pathways to participation, right? Is there an action that you can take? And the action could just be, is this story a credible story to share? And exposure to circumstances beyond their own, right? Getting outside of their bubble. And these are part of like what journalism should be. And this puts a lot of onus on readers to really be news literate in a way of figuring out, if they're in the news neighborhood, are they actually paying attention to what's happening? Are they looking for sources outside of themselves? But I wanted to share this kind of thinking of what the role of journalism is as a way to think about journalism as a public service. When I used to work with high school teens specifically, now I do high school and college. Anytime, any program I ran, students could get community service credit at their school for this. And you can't do that if you're joining some other program, right? If you're part of debate or if you're part of the recycling club, that may not necessarily count as community service. But in the form of what you're doing in journalism, you're really reporting for somebody else. It's not about you as the reporter. It's about the stories you're letting be told, the stories that you're giving a megaphone to in the realm of your student publication. So, we can talk about reporting as there's a journalist out in the field with a microphone and they're taking notes and they're talking to all these people and making phone calls and meeting deadlines, like a very emergency room style, like, hurry up, there's deadline, I have to make it happen. But the larger aspect of what we do as journalists and what we do in journalism is really to inform people so they can make better decisions about their lives. So there's some journalism, as we all know, that doesn't do this. But for the sake of what we're doing, what makes quality journalism and why journalism important, you want to make sure that we're hitting these three roles. Now, I can't see my time with the tweet up, so I don't know how I'm doing. But I don't want to eat into Tina's time at all. But
it's okay. You're doing
okay,
good.
Great. The one other thing I wanted to get into is this aspect, we talked about journalism as investigative. And so that goes to this watchdog aspect of what journalism is. So when we think about that, there's a great quote from Justice Brandeis about sunlight being the best disinfectant. And in journalism, what we mean by sunlight is the best disinfectant is once people start paying attention, once you know someone's paying attention, you start to clean up your act. And so the role of the journalist really fits into this watchdog aspect of who's making sure the city council person's not putting money in their pocket that's supposed to go to job training, who's making sure that the school principal has, meets all the qualifications she did on her resume, that she's not lying about, her college degrees, making sure that the EPA, head of the EPA isn't taking money from oil lobbyists behind, under the table, right? These are the things journalists go in and explore. And it's not because they're trying to do it better or different than anyone else. It's because you deserve to have this information. And so journalists are always working on behalf, and you hear journalists talk about their jobs, and we always say, we're not well paid. Under some administrations, we're not particularly well respected. And a variety of other things like the hours suck. There's so much work, all of that great stuff, the work-life balance with the journalist. But why people do this is because we want to provide a public service. And this information needs to get done, right? Journalism is one of the only professions that's mentioned in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution overall. This is what the First Amendment does. It protects journalists and protects the freedom of the press. And that really elevates the work that we do, that it goes beyond the bad pay, long hours, little respect, that it gets a little bit as a larger force behind that. And I'm telling you this as a way because I want you to think about either your role as a future journalist or your role as a news consumer, that it really is a heightened stance. It's not, it's the job that requires a bit of a calling, because you really are out there pursuing the truth and what that matters for not only yourself as an individual, but your community and your audience and your readers. It's really a larger goal there. So when we talk about journalists doing things like reporting, calling the phone, emailing sources, digging through data, all of that is true. But what they're really doing is trying to help you find a way trying to give you the information you need to make better decisions about your life. I don't know if what you want to add from there, Tina. I know that was a very lofty way of looking at what a journalist's role is, but I wanted to kind of set the framework for you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Katina. Thank you so much, Zilali, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to everybody that's setting aside time on a Saturday to be here and listen to us. I noticed that we have somebody from Cameroon, which is wonderful because that was part of my beat when I was based in West Africa. And I also noticed we have someone from Hawaii, which is wonderful because that's a place I've been several times on vacation, and I hope to go back soon. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to talk a very little bit about my job now, which is as an editor. And then I'm going to go on and talk to you more about my life as a foreign correspondent, because I have a feeling that you're more interested in hearing about that than what it's like being an editor. But being an editor is a critical part of journalism. I mean, Katina talked about fact checking and all these things, and that's basically what an editor does. I started at Time Magazine as an editor about 1.5 years ago. And before Time Magazine, I was at BuzzFeed News as the national editor. I was at BuzzFeed News for 2.5 years. In fact, some of the things you're seeing up on your screen now, which Takara is sharing, are visuals from various stories that I edited when I was at BuzzFeed and later at Time Magazine. I think a lot of people, if you've seen movies and TV shows about journalism, you may have an image of editors. They're usually men. They're usually sitting in offices. They're usually slamming down phones, yelling at reporters, drinking and smoking, and sometimes throwing things against the wall. So I guess I may have worked for one or two that were like that in the past, but the face of journalism is changing a lot, and I think that's wonderful, particularly because I know so many young women now are getting into the field. So as an editor, I like to think of myself as a partner with my reporters. At BuzzFeed News and at Time Magazine, I work with a small team of reporters, each of whom has different subjects that they focus on. And we mainly work on these kind of long, in-depth news feature stories like the ones you're looking at now. I think the big question a lot of people have is, how does a story get to this point, where you're looking at it in full, beautiful color, either online or perhaps on TV, or maybe you're listening to it on the radio, and often, like in this case, where we still have print magazines, where you're seeing it actually in the magazine. So I'm going to briefly go through that. First of all, every story starts with an idea. Every story you've seen here came to me. Well, it came to me through a reporter who sat down and said, "Hey, I got an idea. I think this could be a good story." One of the very first stories that I edited at Time, which is one of the ones that's displayed here, it was about survivors of shootings, particularly mass shootings, that one, who were suffering lead poisoning because of shrapnel and bullets that had been left in their bodies, even though they'd survived these shootings. And when the reporter, Melissa, came to me with this idea, I was immediately interested in it. Now, the reason this was a smart idea is because, number one, it was extremely timely. The United States had recently just gone through a rash of horrible mass shootings. And the reporter, Melissa, also, she covered these kinds of things. And so she'd kept in regular contact with a lot of sources and survivors that she'd talked to over the months and years. And, the other reason it was a smart idea is because I had absolutely no idea that this was a problem. I had heard about this kind of thing, but only when it involved military members who had been shot while they were out in the field. And I did not know that possibly thousands of people were out there, maybe even some people that we've met, and they'd survived shootings, and for various reasons, they still had shrapnel in their body, and they were facing years of possible illness from lead poisoning. So I said, that's a great idea, let's do it. So once an idea is decided on, then the reporting starts. And once again, if you've watched enough movies and TV shows, I think people have an idea. Non-journalists certainly have an idea that reporting is just a question of, knocking on someone's door, picking up the phone, emailing them, texting, whatever, getting the information, and voila, you have the story. It's a lot more complicated. Sometimes it can be difficult to get people to talk to you, especially in this day and age when there is so much distrust of the media, when there are so many people who think the media make things up. That's where a lot of my role comes in. I work with the reporters to try to figure out, okay, who should we talk to for these stories? And what other information do we need to pull together to make a story work? For instance, with the lead bullet story, it was one thing to talk to people about their lead poisoning, but we wanted to find out how many people in the country might actually be dealing with this problem. That involved going to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That also involved looking at statistics for shootings. It involved talking to medical experts, like, why would a surgeon leave a bullet in somebody's body after they'd been shot? Why not just take it out? So, all right, once the reporting is done, the writing begins. At that point, it's kind of up to the reporter to just start writing. Some reporters do write while they're reporting. That's the way I used to do it. A lot don't. It really all depends on their system. I always feel like one of the biggest things I can do for a reporter when they're writing is give them a deadline. Even if it's not a breaking news story that absolutely positively has to get done by a certain time. I think most people in general work better when they have a deadline set, a target date, and if that way, if they can't meet that deadline, when that date comes up, I say to them, how's that story coming? I was hoping to see it today. What's the issue? And if there is a problem, then they can sit down with me and say, well, the problem is I hope to talk to that person and they won't let me use their name, or they don't want to talk to me, or what have you. At that point, I sit with them and discuss, okay, well, how can we make the story work anyway? It's one of my favorite parts, frankly, of being an editor, is just sitting there and brainstorming with reporters. I think having been a reporter for so long, it really helps me understand what they're going through. Once a story is written, then we get into what Katina talked about, the fact checking. There's a term that I tell my reporters: if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And it sounds funny, but honestly, that is kind of what fact checking is all about. Some news organizations, including thankfully Time and also BuzzFeed News for a while, did have actual full-time fact checkers whose only job was essentially to, check out if your mother really loves you. In a sense, it was to essentially re-report stories. We do give fact checkers credits on stories, by the way, at Time Magazine, because of the amount of research and work they do to help us. For instance, this story you're looking at right now about education and attempts to make schoolwork during the pandemic. The way a fact checker might work on a story like this is they'll look at the quotes and they will say to the reporter, I need to see the transcript, or I want to hear the recording of that interview so that I can make sure the quote is exactly as it is in the story. If they see somebody described as 34 years old, they often might go directly to that person and say, are you 34? If so, when is your birthday? They want to make sure that that person is still going to be 34 by the time the story publishes. If there's statistics or percentages in a story, the fact checkers will look at those percentages. They'll look at the numbers. They'll do the math to make sure we got the percentage right. And probably 75% of the time, they will find errors because a lot of journalists are not the greatest mathematicians. The work they do is absolutely critical. And if you are a reporter and you have never gone through a fact check, I got to say it is a humbling experience. And I really hope that any editor and reporter who's worked with fact checkers comes out of it as a better editor and reporter, because, they are always going to catch things that you missed. And the work they do, I just think is so critical, especially in the environment we're in now, where the term fake news gets thrown around so frequently. So I've talked a bit about what it's like as an editor. I'm not going to get into any more detail on that, because I think you probably want to hear about what it's like to be a reporter, especially a foreign reporter. And I think the biggest question people have is, how do I become a foreign correspondent? You're going to see pictures of me in various parts of the world, doing things that people don't do anymore, like changing film and a camera in this case. This was taken back in the 90s in Angola when I was based in South Africa. First, I do want to say that there's no single straight path to becoming a foreign correspondent. I have known foreign correspondents who had so many different backgrounds. But what I do want to emphasize is, if you really want to do it, try it, just go for it. If you do not come from a family of diplomats, if you don't come from a family that's traveled the world, don't let that scare you away. I did not. I went to a state school. I went to public schools where I grew up in Oakland, California. We did not travel internationally when I was a kid. I'm the only journalist in my family. We don't have any diplomats in my family that I'm aware of. But I just knew growing up that this was something I really wanted to do, that it helped that my parents were real news hounds. We had newspapers at home. I watched the news on TV. This was at a time when, in fact, this is in Cameroon, by the way, for our Cameroonian visitor. So I always kind of knew this just looked like an exciting job. I always wanted to be one of those reporters that I saw on TV, getting out of a helicopter in a very elegant, I don't know, they just always looked like they were having an amazing life. Not everybody thought that I was cut out for this. As a matter of fact, I had a career counselor when I was in junior high school who suggested I become a mortician. The reasoning was, I said, why is that? And she said, because you're artistic and creative and you have a very serious demeanor. And I thought to myself, well, maybe I should try to change up my image a little bit. And I started looking through the yearbook and I realized that journalists looked like they were having more fun than anybody. So I got a job in the high school newspaper. And that is the first step I would recommend everybody take if you have any option at all. Any news outlet at your high school or your college, whether it's a radio station, whether it's TV, whether it's a magazine or an online or print newspaper, if you can get on that, do it. Even if you think you want to say go into radio and there is no radio station, you know what? It's not so much the platform. It's the experience of journalism and being an actual news operation that works. So I would urge you to take that opportunity and do it. It's a lot of fun. I'd also urge you to do it when you get to college, which I did. Like I said, I went to a state school, San Diego State University. And the first thing I did was get a job with the college paper. As a matter of fact, my first job with the college paper was delivering the college paper. I was so eager to get in. It didn't last long because it required me to get up at 3:30 in the morning and to make sure the newspaper was on the stands by 5 a.m. When I started sleeping through classes, I decided this wasn't going to work. But I did get a job as a reporter at the college paper, and I ended up staying in that job and then moving on to hold various editors' jobs at the college paper. Now, one of the reasons this was such a good thing to
I think
do.
we have to interrupt you, Tina, and find out what happened here.
I will get to that. I will get to that.
Okay.
One of the reasons it was such a good thing to do working at the college paper is it opened the door to the next step I recommend everybody go for, internships. Professional internships are just so critical. They are so important because they will give you a level of professional experience that really gives you a leg up on other people when you graduate and start applying for professional jobs. By the time I graduated from college, I had interned at the Los Angeles Times. I'd interned at a wire service. I'd interned at a very small local newspaper in San Diego County, which was one of my favorite internships of all. And that really made a big difference. It did help me a lot to get my first job when I graduated college, which was at the Associated Press. That's basically what launched my foreign correspondence career. I'm not saying it's easy, these internships. I know a lot of them are not paid, and that frankly sucks. None of mine were paid at the time either. So I did a lot of part-time jobs. I mean, I would intern at the LA Times 2 or 3 days a week, and then I'd go to my job at a deli, making sandwiches for people. It was a very kind of weird experience, but, I always had that goal in mind. The AP was a great launch pad for me to become a foreign correspondent. Most of the photos you're seeing are in various parts of Africa. My first assignment for the Associated Press, when they sent me overseas, I was fortunate enough that they sent me to South Africa. This was in 1991, and it was a great time to be there. Nelson Mandela had just been released from prison. In fact, I have a picture of him that I keep right next to me. So I got the joy of covering South Africa's first democratic election. I got to literally ride on a campaign bus with, Nelson Mandela and the ANC. From there, I went to West Africa. I was based in Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire for the AP. And after about 3 years there, I left the Associated Press and moved into the newspaper world. Different kind of writing, different kind of reporting in a sense. But once again, it just gave me new opportunities to kind of learn more about the kind of journalist I really wanted to be and the kind of journalism I really wanted to do. My last full-time foreign assignment was here in Baghdad. I ended up joining the Los Angeles Times in 2006 to become their Baghdad bureau chief. And I spent about 2.5 years in that job before I came back to the United States as a national correspondent for the LA Times. Now, you'll notice in a lot of these pictures, I'm smiling because it looks like I'm having a really good time. It's a really fun job. However, you'll also notice, as Katina noted, that there are some pictures, like one where I'm in a hospital room with my leg up in a cast. It's also a very dangerous job. And I don't just mean that in terms of you could get in a car crash and break your leg like I did in that particular incident. You can also get kidnapped, which happened to me in the 1990s in Somalia. And I think, unfortunately, as we've seen also in the United States, distrust of the media is growing all over the world. journalists, whether they are American or European or Asian, wherever they are in the world, in Africa, they are getting arrested and they are getting put in prison. And that's a really scary thing. I think it's another reason that it's so important to have foreign correspondents to tell the world what's really happening there. But I also do tell people it is a risky profession, and it's more risky now than it ever was. And if you're going to go into it, I think you have to go into it with an open mind and just acknowledge that there are going to be some stories that maybe you really just don't feel comfortable covering and you just think the risk is not worth it. That's fine. I used to say to younger journalists after I'd been overseas for a number of years, everybody has a line in the sand where they just feel like it's too dangerous. I just can't do that story. And, if you're so scared going into a story that you simply can't get anything done, then it's just, you're not getting your job done anyway. The people used to ask me, and they still do, as a woman, weren't you really scared of sexual assault on the job? I think they always are surprised when I say no. I think the main reason, the reason I say that is because sexual assault and rape are not risks that are unique to being a foreign correspondent. Kidnapping is. Getting in a helicopter crash is. I spent a lot of time in helicopters. Some of them were really old, creaky helicopters, and those scared me. I mean, it's a real rush in a helicopter. It's exciting, but you realize if this helicopter goes down, it's dangerous. I worried about getting sick on assignment, being in a remote area. I had malaria at least 3 times in Africa and was hospitalized all 3 times for it. I worried about car crashes. The picture you saw was taken in Pakistan. The picture you saw of me in the hospital room with 2 of my former colleagues, one of whom, Mohammed Bazi on the left, is now a journalism professor at NYU. This happened shortly after 9/11. I was in Pakistan reporting on the aftermath of 9/11, and I was in a car which lost its brakes in the Kashmir region of Pakistan as we were coming down a very steep and narrow mountain road. And to this day, I'm amazed that a bashed up leg and some other minor injuries are the worst that anybody suffered. In fact, nobody else was injured in that crash. But that does give you a sense of some of the dangers that you really do have to think about. And that's why, most people go overseas now, they go through something we call hostile environment training, which I have not done myself. It honestly wasn't offered when I was first becoming a foreign correspondent. I would urge any of you, if you're serious about doing this, try to get one of these courses. Maybe there's some scholarships, maybe some of these places that offer it give special student rates. I think it's a really good thing to do because I think it'll give you a good sense of where your line in the sand is and how far you're willing to go. And you might decide that this isn't really something for you. So in that case, great. Stay in the United States, which if you're in the US, which to me, frankly, is the biggest, most exciting story in the world right now, or better yet, become an editor like me. It's a great job too. So with that, I think I'm going to open it up to some questions now.
I think we're going to have 2 rounds of questions. We'll do a few now and then a few at the end too. So we'll time cap this one a little bit, but you can see why journalists make great dinner party guests. I think we could all listen to Tina talk for the rest of the session, but I know you all have some questions too.
We could also be gathering the questions in the Q&A and then hold off until the very end, just so that way we ensure that you have, that you can make your presentation, Katina.
I'm fine doing it that way. If we end up having to go a bit over, I'm always happy to answer more questions. So okay. Yeah, I want to hear more from Katina and
let's go ahead and have Q&A at the very end. So my students and others joining, please type your questions into the Q&A box and we will get to them. But I'm going to turn it over to Katina now.
Great. So my part here now is just to really underline in big, bold lines what Tina was saying about you don't have to wait to be a journalist. You can start now. And whether you're a teen, whether you're in your early 20s, there's no reason to wait for you to become a journalist. I want to show you a couple of examples of stories that happen right now that show this amazing kind of the effect of student journalists. So this one here, this New York Times story, student journalists on college campuses are covering how COVID is affecting their campus more than any other journalist can. They're talking about, are there not socially distanced gathering at frat houses? What are students doing that are breaking the rules, that are creating these coronavirus outbreaks on campus, right? This is what college journalists are covering. And what's happening, as we're learning right now, especially as numbers are going up, that what's happening on college campuses is even more important, because college students are then coming home for Thanksgiving or for the holidays and then spreading and, you know, contributing to the spread of the virus. So the fact that college students are covering this on their campus is really important to the overall story of what's happening during the pandemic. The next story I want to show you is next to our high school students, right? So this next one, so these students in Kentucky at this it's a fantastic college newspaper, or sorry, high school newspaper, did some research, and they were looking into the police training, police officer trainings. And what they found was that the Kentucky State Police was using quotes from Hitler to train their officers. So they're also talking about people being calling for ruthless violence, and really trying to train police officers in a way that is essentially unacceptable right now, but ever. But the idea of using Hitler quotes in it, and this was a student journalist found this out. And actually, one of the students who worked on the story was a student I had worked with in an environmental journalism program, right? They were doing this story, this came up, they reported on it, and then it became a national story based off what these students uncovered. The next story, this is again, high school journalist, a 16-year-old found out that her superintendent had sent their child to a private school outside of the district, which for a public school superintendent is a little bit of a no-no. But this is what a high school journalist found out. The example I used before about a principal's resume, that they lied on the resume, a high school student found that out. So these are all actions you can take right now as a student journalist. If in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, I'm curious to see either who has a newspaper at their school, high school, or college. And if you work on it, I would love to hear that too. So if you want to populate the chat with that, that would be really interesting to know. If you don't have a high school newspaper, you can start one, right? Somebody has to, I'm sure at some point there was one, you can start one. All you really need is yourself as an interested student, get a teacher that you trust who's on your side, and ideally has some clout with the administration. And that's really what you need to start a student newspaper. And then you can email me. And at the end of it, I'll help you from there. At the end of this presentation, I'll give you contact information. But this is, if you don't have one, you can start one. If you don't respect I used to work with a lot of student journalists outside of a school setting, and they weren't particularly happy with their school newspapers. So then go in and help fix it, help make it better, help make it relevant to the school. There's a lot of student newspapers dealing with censorship from their administration. And strangely enough, students in school have more First Amendment protections than student journalists do. Your administration is allowed to censor the work, your administration is allowed to review the work before you publish it. And in some states, they're allowed to make changes to it and censor it. There's a whole movement going on, and I can't remember if New Mexico is one of the new voices states, but there's a whole movement going on across the country to give students back their First Amendment rights. So there's a lot of people in your state, no matter what state you're in, who are working to help student journalists kind of get the respect they deserve and also get the freedom they need to report well on their school campuses. But that doesn't mean whether or not your school is New Voices or not, doesn't mean you can't go ahead and start reporting. Same for college. Most colleges have newspapers. It's a great way, as Tina said, to get experience. And what I will say for both high school and college, you cannot get an internship you cannot get a job in journalism without having an internship. More journalism internships are paying now than they used to, but you have to get an internship. And one of the great ways to get an internship is by building your clip portfolio. And so if we go back to the other slide so this one. So I put together this list of media outlets for teen journalists. So these are a series of outlets. I'm sure there's a lot more who will hear from teens, but these are the ones that I've either worked with or know well who want to hear from teens writing. Specifically, you'll see on this list something called the 74, and I'll put it in the chat too. The 74 is an education website, and they are begging for content, for essays about what's going on with education in the pandemic from teen writers. And I just heard from the editor this week that he's really having a hard time filling this spot. Again, this is in this chart. You'll see the bit.ly link that'll go in the chat too. So take this, download it. I update it regularly, but I want to make sure you get published. I want to make sure you have these opportunities, but you have to take the opportunities, right? If you are interested in journalism and you don't know where to start right now, email the 74 and say, hey, I want to tell you about my education experience during the pandemic. I don't think they've published anyone from New Mexico yet. They're specifically looking for teens of color, but that doesn't mean they're only looking for teens of color. So please write them. Please tell them you want to do something. You want to write something for them, and the editors will help you. Right? What Tina said is, a lot of times, do a lot of editings of teens, and I make so many comments on their pieces. What I have to tell my writers is my job as an editor isn't to point out what you did wrong. My job as an editor is to help you make a better story. These editors that you'll work with here will also help you make a better story. So, and I know it's hard not to be like, well, I don't have anything to say. Why would anyone want to listen to what I have to say? These people want to listen to what you have to say. What you have to offer, especially in the world of journalism, is that you have access to a population and a perspective that nobody else does. As a high school student or a college student, you're in touch with all the sources you need. You're a young person. They are not. For these like older adult publications, you're writing for adults. And I always love this like teen to adult kind of relationship, because adults are making decisions about your lives every day, but they don't ask you. They don't ask you what you think of the dress code. They don't ask you about how you think the school should happen during the pandemic, right? So it's up to you to go in there and tell them. And that's why I love this like teen to adult type of journalism. And especially right now, people really want to hear from young people. You're the ones changing election. Young voters are the ones who like flip Georgia, right? Young voters are the ones who are creating protest and creating the country that they want. So publications want to hear from you. So if you're worried that you're not good enough, or you're not worthy enough to be heard, know that you have a story to tell, or you have the access to tell these stories. So talk to your peers, get in touch with these editors and write these pieces. Because people want to hear from you. Young people make up 26% of the population, but they don't make up 26% of news stories. And you're going to have to push forward to make that happen. So start writing, start contacting editors, start a publication. Don't think that you can't do this because you're young and inexperienced. If you fail, so what? You got a learning experience out of it. We've all learned so much more from things that didn't go well than things that did, right? So you have to put it out there, and you're not risking anything. So what if an editor saw a piece of yours and was like, I don't think I'm going to run that. So what? It's just one editor. Some other editor may want to run it. There's part of this being a thick skin. I don't think Tina normally talks about journalists having thick skins, and you kind of have to, right? You're in the field, you're talking to people who may not want to talk to you. You'll get a lot of no's, but they don't want to be interviewed. Or you get a lot of no's as a reporter. An editor is like, no, that's not a story I want to do. And that's fine. Your job is believing in yourself and your sources and the story you need to tell. Did you want to add something there, Tina?
I did not. I think Katina really nailed it there. I'm just looking at some of the questions that people have jotted down. I'm not, Takara, did you want me to just go ahead, me and Katina, just start answering these questions? Takara, I think you're muted.
Yes, go for it.
Okay, in that case, I tell you what, I don't think I can answer all of these, but there's a couple that really jumped out at me, in part because they are music to my ears. This one from Bodie Russell. How can journalists make a fact checker's life easier? I can tell you that every fact checker and copy editor I know would want you on their staff. It kind of goes back to that ridiculous saying I mentioned earlier. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. When you are doing your story, if somebody says something or gives you document, I guess is the simplest answer to that. We do a lot of stories, certainly at BuzzFeed News in my job on the national desk, and at Time. We do a lot of stories with people making allegations or saying things that might be a bit controversial. If they say, I got a medical bill for $48,000 and I only visit the doctor once, first thing I say is, okay, let's get a copy of that medical bill. This is the kind of thing fact checkers are going to look for. It's the kind of thing they're going to want to see. If you're quoting from a piece of a police report, include a screenshot or, call the police department and get them to send you that police report so you can actually show the fact checkers the police report. Make sure you record. It's so easy now to record interviews, save the recordings so that it's really simple and quick for the fact checkers to be able to just, check the quotes and make sure that those quotes are accurate. One error can give a lot of people an opportunity to discredit an entire story, much less 2 or 3 errors, even if they're little tiny errors. So you don't want any errors in your stories. So just document everything you do. Another question I saw, what was your favorite story to cover? This is one I get a lot. It's actually a pretty easy story. It's actually a pretty easy question to answer. There's 2. Number 1, of course, the coverage of Nelson Mandela being elected as the first Black president of South Africa. That was a great story for so many reasons. Partly, it was my first big foreign assignment. Partly, it was just a great news story, and it was exciting, and it was just, to be there in the middle of history, right there on the doorstep of history, being able to document it for a huge audience. I was working for the Associated Press at the time. It was great. I loved it. I still do. The other of my favorite stories, a very different kind of story, and a different reason it's one of my favorites, was when I was the Baghdad bureau chief. This was not a story I had ever really wanted to cover, frankly. I wasn't expecting to become the Baghdad bureau chief. And it was a very hard story to cover for me because I was definitely not any kind of a Middle Eastern expert at that point. The reason, though, it ended up being one of my favorite stories is because of my local staff. The Iraqi reporters and translators that I worked with were just wonderful. We had a very close-knit staff, and one of the things I was able to do was to get expedited visas for most of them, if not all of them, who wanted to immigrate to the United States. And now most of them are actually living here in the United States. Their families are here. It's changed their lives. They've just, most of them are US citizens. A lot of them voted in their very first presidential election just a few weeks ago. So it's a really nice feeling to know that you could just have that kind of impact on the lives of so many people and their families. I am also going to try to answer, let's see, there was a question. What motivates you to keep pushing forward after moments like being kidnapped or breaking your leg in a crash? I would say the simplest answer to that is, as a journalist, I never sought to be the story. And so when I did end up kind of being the story, my attitude was, okay, when people lose interest in hearing about my car crash or being kidnapped, I'm just going to keep being a journalist. I never wanted to be defined by any of these things that happened to me. There was never a point where I felt like giving up as a journalist. It's not to say I didn't learn from both of these experiences. I mean, it's terrifying to be kidnapped. My kidnapping, I was held hostage for 3 weeks in Somalia in the mid-90s. At that time, journalists in Somalia, journalists were not being kidnapped in Somalia, and certainly relatively young female journalists were not being kidnapped. So it was there was a lot of interest when I got out and people started to hear about what had happened. But my attitude was, I'm going to take a couple of months off, going to see my family, take a vacation, and then I'm just going to go back to work. And that's exactly what I did. And I did the same thing after the car crash. Took a while to recover from that car crash. I ended up having to have 2 surgeries on my leg. But instead of dwelling on that, I just dwelt on the fact that it could have been so much worse. And all of us in that vehicle were so, so fortunate. And I just felt like, yeah, maybe I'll be a lot more careful about what kind of car I rent in the future. And there's no question about it. I've always been a nervous passenger since that happened, but it just didn't hold me back from doing a job that I really loved. Let's see. I'm not going to get into the details of the kidnapping. I see there's quite a number of questions about it. It would take too long. If you are all journalists, and I guarantee if you just try to do enough digging on your own, you will be able to find more information about how the whole thing got resolved.
And Tina, let me say, you have no responsibility to answer all of the questions, so don't feel like that burdens on your shoulders.
No, not at all. Some of them are just so good and so smart. The language question that just came in. Did you learn any other languages while covering stories? How do you get past language barriers? This is such a crucial issue for foreign correspondents. First of all, I did learn other languages, but not while covering stories. Personally, I don't feel like I'm really good at picking up second languages. Like, unfortunately, so many Americans, I was not exposed to learning other languages until I was in junior high school. However, I did study French when I was in high school, which helped me immensely when I moved to West Africa for the Associated Press. And when I got my first job with the AP in San Diego, California, I took it upon myself to start taking Spanish lessons at the local junior college because I realized, well, here I am on the border. It would be really good to learn Spanish. Of course, I got sent to countries initially where none of those languages were spoken, so they didn't really do me any good. Therefore, I did have to work with translators a lot. The biggest question people have is, how do you know that you can, trust your translator when you're working with them? It's a really smart question. Your goal is to always work with a translator that frankly comes recommended by another journalist, which was something I did a lot of. If you can't go that route, then your next goal is to, try out the translator for maybe just 48 hours. And if you can usually tell by body language. I mean, journalists should have a pretty good sense of observation. If somebody answers a question in a language you don't understand, and they talk for a long time, and your translator just looks at you and says, they said no, that's a really good idea that maybe your translator is not translating as much as you would like. The one thing about working with translators, I always say to journalists, is it's very, very time consuming. You have to give your translator time to absorb what someone's saying and give you the right answer. And it's also exhausting to translate. I mean, there have been times where I talked to somebody, using French and was listening to them, but kind of having to take notes in English because my French writing is not good enough. it's really it's really a mentally exhausting thing to do. So I never wanted to force translators I worked with to work for more than a couple hours at a time before we took a break. Let's see, trying to find some other questions. What profession would I have gone into if not journalism? It's a very good question. Well, if you ask my career explorations teacher, she would have said being a mortician. I don't think I would have done that. I think I may have become a veterinarian, although I must admit spending years in school was not my favorite thing, which explains why I actually didn't go to graduate school for journalism. But I always loved animals. A lot of my friends will tell you that when I was overseas as a foreign correspondent, many times I'd find a way to mention an animal in a story. So it's just something I've always been drawn to, the animal side of life. But I do think that becoming a journalist was, I don't know, it just seemed like something I was born to do. I want to see, Katina, are there any of these questions that you think would be good for you to answer? This one about fighting misinformation and breaking through echo chambers.
Well, I was going to talk about, Victoria had a question about considering the rampant distrust of the media, what is the future of journalism? And as a journalism educator, I want to say the future of journalism is you, right? As the participants, like this, you are the future of journalism. And I don't mean that as like young people are the future. What I mean is, right now that the business model of journalism is not broken. The business model of journalism needs some help. And that's where you're going to come in. You need to help create what is the next step for journalism. What does journalism look like? Who's going to get it? How are they getting the information? Right now, over the last probably 3 or 4 years, maybe 5, this role of audience engagement in journalism is this new thing that didn't really happen the same way that it happened years ago. And audience engagement is both using social media to get stories out to people who need to see these stories and as a way to kind of spread the information. But it also means working with the community and helping really understand what the stories are that need to be told. Yeah. This idea of the rampant distrust of the media is true. And I know one of the students I've worked with, who's a journalist now, but he's taking a class of mine, after the election, he was like, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm gay, and I'm a journalist. Like, I spent the last 4 years of my life in fear. And now I feel like maybe I can relax a little bit. That's real. The thing is, people still relied on news to get their information, right? Like, we can all say, like, not we, but let's say my in-laws, for example, will say something like that the news is fake or that everything's made up, nothing really, but they're still getting their information from the news. They're still watching it. They're not reading the news, but they're watching it every night on TV. Right. News matters to all of us. And this election really brought home how important, this is where we got all of our information. We weren't calling up election polling offices and finding out information, right? We were reading this. We were reading the news. We were watching it. Even if we're just seeing headlines, right? There's a whole other movement besides the fact of protecting the future of journalism, is training people how to be better news consumers. I don't know. I don't think there's many high school classes, but I know a lot of colleges are building off on this idea of how to be stronger news consumers. And that's part of what the journalism and education industries are doing together to help support journalism. And it really is understanding like what is good journalism? Why is journalism different than any other forms of communication and propaganda and advertising? What makes it different, and what you need to look for in a news story, right? What are the sources? Who did they talk to? Are they informed? Is it verified? All of these great news literacy tools, but it's up to us as consumers not to just share things. And I spend way more time on Twitter than I should. And I see a lot of stories, and I only share stories from value from sources that I know are credible. And so that puts a lot of onus back on news consumers to do the same thing. And I know we're getting close on time. And so we do have a slide with some contact information in there too. So if you want to reach either me or Tina, you can have, there's put up an email address for you. And it goes to me, but I'll share it with Tina. And there's information about how, if you want to get my book, and it's a student journalism, essentially a 101 book on how to be a student journalist. You can reach me on Twitter or Instagram. I keep a channel of Dear Teen Journalist, which is essentially writing and journalism advice for young people. So we would love to hear from you. And thank you for spending your Saturday with us and for allowing us to spend our Saturday with you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, sorry, Takara, was that you? Did I interrupt somebody?
You're fine, go ahead.
Yeah, I did just want to add, and I know we're maybe going over a little bit. I'm not sure if you need to cut us off, fine. But I cannot leave without answering Zitlali's question because she was so kind to introduce us. She asked, as a bureau chief, did you have specific assignments for reporters or did they go out and find stories on their own? Very good question. A little of both. Honestly, even now, my goal is for reporters to come up with their own ideas. But occasionally I do have specific assignments. I don't call them assignments though. I just say, hey, I have a great idea. Are you interested? And it just sounds nicer than saying, hey, I have an assignment for you. And there were some other questions in here. I don't know if we can add another few minutes. I'd be happy to answer them if we can. If we cannot though, I understand.
So we have time for probably one more question and then I do need to wrap it up.
Okay. Okay, let me find something then. My goodness.
And while she's looking for questions, I put in the chat Katina's book, A Newshound Guide to Student Journalism. We do have a virtual bookstore and I put a link to that in the chat. So I would encourage you all to look at that. Yeah.
I think this one about how do you cope with the fact that you might get kidnapped in a foreign country? I would say the broader question should be, how do you cope with the fear that something could happen to you bad when you're on an assignment? I think it goes back to the drawing the line in the sand issue. I always say to colleagues, especially younger colleagues, go with your gut. We all know when we get that kind of sick feeling in our stomach, when the hair on the back of our neck stands up and we're just like, oh, I don't feel good about this. If you get that feeling, that's your time to say, I'm sorry, but you guys go ahead. I'm going to sit this one out. Having said that, though, I also always recommend that then you have a plan B, because somewhere in the world, there is an editor like me who's expecting a story. And if you go to your editor and say, I didn't feel good about that, so I just didn't do it, there's a good chance the editor is going to say, okay, well, what else have you got? What can you give me? So always have a plan B, have a plan C, have a plan D, E, and F as well. Because no matter where you are, there's a very good chance that your best laid plans are simply not going to work out. So I would say with that, thank you all so much for listening. And thank you to Takara and Zitlali and Katina for
I just want to extend a huge thank you to the both of you for taking time out of your schedule to meet with us, to meet with the students here in New Mexico, but also from Hawaii and in Cameroon. I do appreciate that you both have done this. Again, I put the links to relevant information in the chat, and I can also share Katina's PowerPoint that includes the link to the Google Doc as well as both of their information. Zitlali, I also want to say thank you so much for your kind introduction. You did an awesome job. Thank you all for attending this session. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. I will be sending an email to all attendees with that information. So thank you so much. I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon, and I bid you adieu.